All right, well, with that introduction, I'm sure we're all excited. See, I take the opposite approach. I actually intentionally put my most boring material here so that when you do fall asleep, you'll blame it on the meal and not the tongue. But we'll see. Hopefully we'll enjoy the next hour or so together here thinking about early Baptist origins and the writing of Baptist history. When you heard that title, you think, oh, he wasn't kidding about that. But it is actually very interesting. So this, to me, and hopefully to you, this subject matter, in a sense, kind of takes us, swerves us a little bit, but I do think it all connects to what we just discussed. In my third and then fourth session, it's going to be a more direct kind of continuation of what I started in the first talk in terms of thinking about the history of ideas, in this case the history of theological and ecclesiological ideas and how one builds on the next. So we're going to return to that. In this session, we're going to talk a little bit about names and labels and the ways in which we describe the past. And then we're going to come back to that theme a little bit off and on through all the remaining sessions that I'm doing, and then explicitly in the final session when we're going to think about the label Reformed Baptist and what we make of that. But here I do just want to focus our minds a little bit on labels and the names that we give to things. And I think it's one of these questions that we sometimes overlook, but we do so at our peril, because a label, inevitably, whether you want to or not, when you label a thing, you are also interpreting that thing. You're telling a story about the thing. Every label, every name, every descriptor tells a story about the thing that it names or labels or describes. It cannot not do so. You have to choose something to describe a thing, and what you choose says something about how you interpret it. And because labels interpret without even trying to, and because we use them often so casually, sometimes they can be a sneaky thing, because they can actually tell a story about something while sort of acting as though they're just a neutral descriptor. And you see this all the time in the way we talk about things. In our political discourse, we're always kind of wrangling over labels in this way. So for example, to choose an obvious one, should someone who believes that the killing of the unborn is a grievous evil, should that individual be described as anti-abortion or pro-life? The label you fix on tells a story. It interprets the issue a little bit. Do you describe a particular gathering of people who are upset about something as a protest or a riot or an uprising? Each label interprets it differently. Think of rather different associations that come to mind when you think of a particular group. Do you describe it as traditionalist or far right? The label that you use tells a story. In our own chatting about it, if you have someone in your church who wants to ask you about a particular position and a particular person who holds it, do you say, well, that person is a heretic? Or do you say a false teacher? Or do you just say, oh, well, I disagree with him on that issue? The way we describe people and label things and events interprets and tells a story. We could go on and on. And again, the problem is that labels interpret necessarily, but they often do so quietly, while purporting, or if we're not thinking about them, we can imagine they purport to be neutral, value-free descriptors. I'm not interpreting this thing, that's just what it's called. And sometimes that is probably the way we talk, and it's okay. And if you had to interrogate and question and give an hour-long lecture about every single label, you wouldn't get very far in life. A chair is a chair, etc. However, when we're thinking about the past and we're thinking about history and we're thinking about Christian history and church history, I think the stakes for the labels we use are upped considerably. We need to be careful how we describe people and ideas and movements in church history. The historian of the English Reformation, Peter Marshall, has commented on this phenomenon, and listen to what he says. He says, there are particular dangers in careless or unreflective use of religious and confessional labels. Why? Well, he says that when historians inappropriately label historically situated religious groups and ideas and movements, he says that, quote, religious and confessional labels, quote, create teleological presumptions about patterns of development, sanitizing conditions of disorder or uncertainty, and obscuring pointers to paths not taken. So what does he mean? Labels can create teleological presumptions. They imagine, the use of the label imagines that a certain thing has a certain end in view. Well, we know the end of the story. We know that this group eventually ends up being this particular thing. They eventually go that way. They eventually kick those folks out. They eventually align with that group over there. We know how the story ends when we're doing history. And so the temptation is very strong to attach a label to a group, an idea, a movement in the past that is informed by our awareness of how the story ends. Now, again, sometimes that's okay. It's not a big deal to call World War I World War I. People in 1918 were not calling it World War I. So some of these things are okay, but the danger is if we don't think about it, we're not aware of these tendencies, we can actually distort our reading of the history because we're so informed, implicitly or otherwise, by the labels that we have imposed on past actors, ideas, events, movements, etc. So that's the danger that he's warning us against. I'll read it again. Labels can create teleological presumptions about patterns of development, sanitizing conditions of disorder or uncertainty, and obscuring pointers to paths not taken. Sanitizing conditions of disorder or uncertainty. That's an interesting way of thinking about it. Sanitizing conditions of disorder or uncertainty. So in other words, the reality at the time was rather messy. A label cleans it up. So there was actually a lot of things going on and a lot of confusion, but we impose a label and it makes it seem as though, there were really nice, clear boundary lines. Everybody knew what was going on. You had the X's and the O's and it was all neat and tidy, when in fact it wasn't. So there's all these ways in which our use of labels can sometimes, if we're not careful, actually suggest realities that did not exist. So it's not that labels are bad, labels are inevitable. It's just that we want to think about the labels we use, and all things being equal, we want labels that tell true stories about the men and women, the ideas and movements that they purport to describe. That's our challenge. And often the labels we use are convenient, and sometimes they're what we've come to expect through common usage. And so often we don't interrogate the labels we use. And again, you can't interrogate every label. However, we should interrogate some, particularly the ones that mean the most to us, and especially if we think there might actually be some issues with the labels. And so one of the ideas that has captivated me over the years is that some of the labels that traditional Baptist historiography has employed to describe early modern English Baptists have sometimes been less than helpful. And so that's what I want to talk a little bit about in this lecture. And again, we'll return explicitly to the concept of labeling in my fifth and final talk when we think about that Reformed Baptist label. But for now, let's think about some of the ways in which early modern English Baptists were described and ways in which they self-described. That's a good place to start. The challenge of self-identification in the mid-17th century. Maybe we can start like this. Now imagine most of us are aware of this, but let's just lay it out. Traditional Baptist historiography, and when we talk about historiography, we're just referring to the writing of history. So historiographical debates are less about the history itself, what happened, and they're actually debates about how historians have talked about or written about the historical events in question. So, in a nutshell, traditional Baptist historiography has gone like this. You have a category called Early English Baptists. So folks we've been talking about, 17th century English people who come to reject paedobaptism. They're labeled Early English Baptists, and this category is subdivided into two subcategories. So you have particular Baptists and general Baptists, all labels that historians have used to describe these groups. And of course, the terms general and particular refer to questions about salvation, about soteriology, about how we understand Christ's redeeming work. And so, in a nutshell, right, particular Baptists, the story goes, hold that Christ died for a particular people, for the elect. General Baptists, Christ died generally for all. And though these two labels directly map on to those questions of atonement, and is the atonement a limited or definite atonement or a universal one, these terms are broadly used to refer to that whole cluster of interlocking soteriological ideas and questions that we call Calvinism and Arminianism. So, okay. And as outlined above, particular Baptists are widely understood to have emerged from within the Jacob Lothrop Jesse circle that we heard about this morning. And general Baptists are usually traced back to the English exile John Smith, who went to the Netherlands, and his associate, Thomas Hulwys, returned to England in 1612 and started a congregation of general or Arminian-inflected Baptists in that time. So again, when you look at Baptist history books, you'll find these terms used quite commonly to describe the situation. And we should think about it because it is certainly true that you have confessional statements published by Baptistic separatists during the 17th century that do map on to a Calvinistic or particular way of thinking about salvation. And you do have statements and confessions and documents and treatises that map onto Baptistic separatists who held to a more Arminian leaning or Arminian inflected position. That's true. So again, insofar as that describes a historical reality, these are helpful labels and we kind of get what we're talking about, and so what's the problem? Well, it's interesting to me. We don't want to overstate it, but at the same time, I do think these labels, if we're not thinking carefully about what they're saying and what they're not saying, can and have introduced some distortions into the way we think about these particular historical actors. And the first thing that might get us thinking along these lines when we think about these labels is to recognize that during the period that so far we've been talking about, Jared is going to kind of take us further into the 17th century when things start to change and develop in different ways. But during the period we're talking about, 1630s, 1640s, even into the 1650s, first thing we could notice is that the actors themselves weren't using these labels, certainly not in any consistent way, to describe themselves. You don't have that happening. And again, that fact alone is not necessarily problematic, right? I don't hold, some historians do push this way, I don't hold that we should only use kind of labels that the original historical actors would have used. I don't think we need to worry about that per se. Again, people in 1918 were not talking about World War I, and I think that's a perfectly helpful label to describe the thing. The question for me isn't, let's use original actor labels for its own sake. Rather, I think when we realize that these labels are widely used and they weren't used by the original actors, it at least can give us pause to think and to question. And it's quite possible that that is a clue that maybe there is something anachronistic happening. Maybe something is being imposed. Maybe an unhelpful story is being told. And in this case, I do think that to some extent that's the reality. So let's get into this further. Let's think about it like this. We're thinking about labels. We've got this Baptist labeling thing happening by historians. What do we make of that? Well, I think one of the ways to start, again, to get into this question, the challenge I think is often we're trying to get back into the minds of the original historical actors. And we're trying to, as one historian has put it, we're trying to see things their way. And that's a challenge for us because we, understandably, usually see things our way. And normally that serves us very well. But sometimes it's helpful to try to get out of our own frame here in 2025 in the United States and think as they thought. And to do that, we have to question some basic assumptions. So I like to get into this like this. You think about, okay, early 17th century, early 1600s, almost everyone in England accepted unquestioningly that baptizing an infant was a biblical and godly thing to do, right? Sure, you had a few people probably who questioned it, maybe some privately, but those were real outliers. Basically, everybody was on the same page. Yeah, babies should be baptized. Of course, that's what we do. That's what we think. That's good. That's Christian. That's right. And then at some point in the 17th century, they stopped thinking that, or at least a larger number of more mainstream Puritan types started to question that assumption. And what we need to realize, we need to think that way because we need to realize for them, when they did that, how did that shift their self-perception, right? So I accept with everybody else that pedobaptism is biblical. Now all of a sudden I start questioning that piece of my doctrinal platform. How does that affect my self-understanding? And the danger is it's easy for us to think, oh, well, yeah, that's an easy one. This fellow or this woman became a Baptist. But there's a problem with that. There was no category called Baptist for them to sort of slot themselves into. And that's hard for us because here we are quite used to Baptists. There's a lot of Baptists about. In this country, this is the largest Protestant grouping. There was something I saw recently that estimated that there were some 48 million self-described Baptists in the United States. And when you add to that all the folks around the world who would call themselves Baptists, you add to that all the folks associated with, say, Pentecostalism, who don't necessarily take that label, but also don't baptize their infants. We have a lot of people around the world who read their Bibles and don't see pedobaptism in there. And whether they're right or wrong, put to one side, the point is that's a category we have. We're very used to it. And so it's hard for us to imagine a world in which actually nobody was thinking like that. And if you thought that, you were actually a very unusual individual. And actually, you could get yourself into a lot of trouble for thinking like that. It was a very weird and very radical thing to think in the 17th century. So we have to kind of work ourselves back into that sort of space, I think, to start kind of questioning or prying back these labels a bit and seeing, are these labels helpful to us or are they introducing distortions? And again, as I was saying, the reality is the folks who wrote the confession here, 1644, First London Confession, they didn't really, to my read, seem to have a great sense for what to call themselves. Why would I think that? Well, again, we don't see them, when we look at their published works in the 1640s, we don't see them calling themselves Baptists. We don't certainly see them calling themselves particular Baptists to identify what kind of Baptists they were. And when we do see something like their confession, how do they self-describe? Well, they self-describe in a kind of awkward way. They self-describe negatively. They say, here, a confession of faith of those churches which are commonly, though falsely, called Anabaptists. If you think about it, that's a kind of weird thing to do. If you were going to start, an ice cream store, you wouldn't say, not a steakhouse. You would say what you were. So this is a weird thing. So again, we have a label we reflexively apply to these folks, and yet we look at what they're actually saying, and they don't use that label, and not only do they not use that label, they don't seem to know what to call themselves. Well, we're not the people that are Anabaptists, even though that's what we're commonly called. And that kind of negative approach to labeling is something that you do see them doing quite a bit. So for example, 1645, William Kiffin published a document called A Brief Remonstrance of the Reasons and Grounds of Those People Commonly Called Anabaptists. So again, he's saying, this isn't what we are, but this is what some people call us. So they were attentive to labeling, and false labeling, as the case may be. When you read through the discourse, the William Kiffin discourse I just described, what does he call himself and his fellow travelers? Well, he uses different things. He talks about our congregations. He talks about our separated congregations. He talks about gatherings of the saints together. So one, there's some sort of, except for the separation term, which refers more to events on the ground, those are just sort of some biblical terms, gathering of the saints, congregations. I'm hearing a congregational kind of vibe there, but I'm not really seeing anything that would suggest a well-defined self-descriptor. Not Baptist, certainly not particular Baptist. So what do we do with this? During the interregnum, those are the years 1649 through 1660, interregnum because there was no king or queen on the throne in England. During that time, the modifier baptized did come into more frequent usage among Baptistic believers. So for example, you get a reference in 1659 to the, quote, the baptized people of Bledlow. But even that term wasn't consistently used as a self-identifier in the mid-17th century. And it was often, when it was employed, it often wasn't in the service of sort of constructive identity formation. This is who we are, and this is who we all know we are, and this is how we talk. It was often used as sort of political exigencies required it. So, for example, the baptized Christians in Dublin sent a corporate address to the Lord Protector, assuring him of their loyalty. And they need some way to identify themselves so that the person to whom they're writing will know who he's hearing from. So they kind of have to, but they don't truly own it and embrace it, at least not to my reading. So, early modern English Baptists didn't seem to know what to call themselves sometimes, but other people did seem to know what to call them. And I want to talk about two misleading labels. And the first one is one that their contemporaries were using quite a bit. We've already seen it, this Anabaptist label. And this is a label that is very common. You see it all over official documents, theological, polemical treatises, letters, etc. You even see the term immortalized in some of the historic Reformed confessions of faith, in which, talking about continental Anabaptists, the Reformed confessions decry this. So, for example, the Second Helvetic Confession, 1566, says that Anabaptists are refuted by the apostolic teaching. And the Belgic Confession, 1561, another historic Reformed confession, says, therefore, we detest the error of the Anabaptists. Strong language. In fact, the language is so strong, we detest the error of the Anabaptists, that some have argued for that reason, because Reformed confessions talk like that, Baptists cannot or should not call themselves Reformed. We'll return to that in my fifth session. But for now, pressing on, this Anabaptist label is everywhere, always applied to the early modern English Baptists in England. And it's clearly unsatisfactory. If we're talking about labels that accurately describe, that accurately tell the right story, that clarify rather than confuse, this clearly does not fit the bill. In the first instance, it's a term of abuse. You can see it, especially in the English context, used as a term of abuse, but even in the earlier contexts, Anabaptist means re-baptizer. You see that in the use of the Belgic Confession, where after saying that they detest the error of the Anabaptists, they explain why they detest it. They say, we detest the error of the Anabaptists who are not content with the one only baptism they have once received, and moreover, condemn the baptism of the infants of believers, and so on and so forth. So they're not content with their one baptism, which one should be enough for anyone. These people, these troublemakers, are not content, and they want a second baptism. They want to rebaptize themselves. But of course, that obviously is not how Credo Baptists understand what they're doing. even if one was baptized in infancy, from a credo Baptist perspective, whether it's right or wrong, the logic of the position is that was not a baptism in the way the New Testament understands baptism. So it's not a rebaptism at all. So Anabaptist is a term of abuse. It's telling a story. It's interpreting the theology of the people it purports to describe. And certainly from where I sit, it's an unsatisfactory interpretation. And certainly from the perspective of the early modern English Baptists, it was an unsatisfactory interpretation, hence things like that, falsely called Anabaptists. But it's worse than that, actually, in an English context. In a continental context, when the Belgic Confession talks about this, it has certain things in view. It's responding to Anabaptists that were actually on the continent. The interesting thing is when English folks start using this Anabaptist label to talk about early modern English Baptists, they actually don't have a history of Anabaptism the way the continent does. This is for them a recent phenomenon, and they use the Anabaptist label deliberately to connect these new folks who are coming forward and saying, hey, we're not sure about this paedobaptism thing. They're deliberately trying to connect these people in the minds of their hearers to some of the more unsavory things that happened in the 16th century on the continent. Most significantly, when the early modern English mind hears the term Anabaptist, they think of one thing in particular. They think of the 1534 Anabaptist uprising in the German city of Münster. And this is one of the most colorful sort of anecdotes, stories from the Reformation. Many of us will be familiar with it. Essentially, you have some really radical Anabaptists, as they were labeled. I'm not sure if that's even a great label for them, but that's how history has described them, so we'll go with it for now. Really radical folks who seize power in this city of Münster, led by the charismatic Jan van Leyden, pictured there. They seize control. They talk about Münster is going to be a new Jerusalem. It's very sort of eschatologically inflected, and apocalyptic stuff is happening. They impose a radical theocracy. Private property is abolished. Money is abolished. Monogamy is maybe not abolished, but polygamy is introduced and in some cases enforced. It's a very extreme situation. Eventually military forces come in and suppress the uprising. The leaders of the group are captured. Many of them are tortured and then executed. Their bodies are put in cages so that all the city can see and learn, do not do what these people did. You can actually still go and see the cages hanging from the church in Münster to this very day. So this is, as you can imagine, a pretty powerful sort of incident in the minds of people. Think about any number of kind of big media stories that are sort of swimming around in our mind as just sort of powerful flashbulbs. 9/11. Everybody who was alive, where you were when that happened, and that means something in your mind. And likewise, Münster was triggering all sorts of associations, none of them good, for early modern folks and for early modern English folks. And so they take this label and they apply it to these new early modern English Calvinistic Baptists that are emerging, like the folks who authored the 1644 Confession of Faith. And they use it and they weaponize it, and they do so deliberately. Think about a group like the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is labeled, say, Focus on the Family, as a hate group. Well, that's a powerful label for people who haven't looked into these things. They hear that and they go, well, hate, who wants to be associated with a hate group? That doesn't sound very good. So you take all these unsavory associations and you lose a label to discredit a whole movement or organization. Likewise, to say, aha, the Anabaptists, is to absolutely cast aspersion on these folks that goes well beyond any real connection to theological debate or even any real connection to history. 1644, Münster happened in 1534, 100 years earlier in a different part of Europe. There's absolutely no connection between these two. The only thing that unites them is that in both cases, these actors questioned whether or not one should baptize infants. But that is not actually a real connection or tie. And so when you look at the rhetoric that was used, you see opponents of early modern English Baptists tying it to Munster deliberately. So for example, a guy called Emmanuel Nutton, who was the parish priest in Nottingham, he wrote that Baptists troubling the Church of England in his own day, this is in the 1640s, so this is 100 years after Munster, he says, "These folks do ill, for they follow those pestilent heretics called Anabaptists in Germany, who sprung up there not very long since about Luther's time." So he's saying these people now are following in the footsteps of those people then. Another example, the eminent polemicist and Westminster Assembly Commissioner Daniel Featley. He wrote a notorious book in which he attempted to refute the Credo Baptist position. And much of it was fine. He makes theological argument, he makes exegetical argument, and that's totally fine. However, he also includes this whole section where he tries to associate early modern English Calvinistic Baptists with these Munsterites and others on the continent. He includes something that he calls the remarkable histories of the Anabaptists, in which he takes the most lurid and sort of controversial accounts, some true, some exaggerated, some false, and he sort of weaves them together to tell the story. This is who these people are, it's who they've always been, and if you, my co-religionists in England today, do not act now to suppress this nonsense, we are going to find ourselves where they found themselves back in Munster. That's the force of it. Another example, one more. This is the Scottish Presbyterian Robert Bailey. He writes this, and he's writing now about the 1644 Confession. And he says, "The Confession of Faith, which 7 of their congregations did put forth, must not be taken for the measure of their faith." In other words, notice what he's doing. He's saying basically, yeah, if you read this First London Baptist Confession, it all sounds pretty okay, except for the Credo Baptist bit, obviously. But clearly, that's not really what they think. He goes on. He says it can't accurately represent their doctrine because, quote, "their usual and received doctrines do much more agree with the Anabaptists in Germany than with the handful who made this confession." And to this end, Bailey promised his readers that he would go on to, quote, demonstrate that the Baptists, the 1644 folks, would demonstrate in time the very same spirit to breathe this day in the Anabaptists of Britain, which inspired their fathers of former times in Germany. So that connection to Munster and to the worst excesses of continental Anabaptism is explicitly drawn and made. Again, Daniel Featley, I quoted him a moment ago. He actually said that in seemingly publishing an orthodox confession, because again, 1644 would not have given much pause to a Westminster Assembly divine in the main. The vast majority of the things in there would be perfectly agreeable to the folks writing and drafting the Westminster Standards. And so Featley says that by putting forward this seemingly orthodox document, the London Baptists actually, quote, "offer to the unlearned their fair cup, full of venom, but anointing the brim with the honey of sweet and holy words. They thrust in a store of true positions, that together with them they may juggle in the venom of their falsehood. They cover a little ratsbane, poison, in a great quantity of sugar, that it may not be discerned." So, labels interpret. Labels interpret. And so the Anabaptist label tells, I think quite clearly, a false narrative about these people who wrote the 1644 London Confession. It was something they were constantly trying to push back against, largely, I think, unsuccessfully. There's another label, I think, that tells a misleading story, or has told a misleading story. And that is one used by later historians from the 18th century onwards. And I have it here, historians called them Baptists. Now, I think the first one, Anabaptist, it's pretty obvious for us to see why that was a misleading, unhelpful label. This one, not so much. What's wrong with this label? And again, I don't want to draw a false equivalence between labels. You know, some labels mislead a lot. Some labels might mislead more subtly. Certainly, I don't want to draw any equivalence between what Featley was doing with the Anabaptist label and what later Baptist denominational historians are doing with the Baptist with a big B label. So I don't want to be heard to be saying that. However, I do think when we really kind of drill down and query this label a bit, there's some potential problems, some potential distortions that it introduces for us. So let's talk about it a little bit, this label, Baptists. This is referring here to the practice of referring generally to any and all in this period who rejected paedobaptism as Baptists with a capital B. And where did this get going? I mentioned that the 1644 signatories were not using this label to describe themselves. So where do we start to see it? Well, where I think you see it most clearly emerge is in the 1650s amongst Quaker polemicists. The 17th century not only gives birth to English Calvinistic Baptists, it's also when we get the Quaker movement originating. And these folks, for various reasons, seem to have deployed this label Baptist to refer just generally in the 1650s to those who question paedobaptism. So, for example, in a 1654 tract called Truth Cleared of Scandals, the Quaker Richard Farnworth referred to, quote, those people called Baptists. And 1655, the Quaker James Parnell likewise described, quote, several meetings betwixt the people called Quakers and the people called Baptists. Now again, I think there's some other interesting stories to tell about Quakers and their usage and their relationship to other so-called radical religious groups, but we'll pass over that. For now, just notice there you do start to get the term Baptist, but it's not used by English Calvinistic Baptists to self-describe. It's used again by their opponents. During the same period, the founders of the Muggletonians, which was another sort of unusual radical group, John Reeve and Ludowick Muggleton, also referred to Baptists in one of their pamphlets, in a pamphlet called Joyful News from Heaven. And you see it again and again. Quaker authors mentioning Baptists in their published tracts. Another example, a guy called John Perot, 1662, wrote a paper directed to all Baptists everywhere. So again, you do see this in use, but what about as a self-identifier? Again, harder to come by. A bit later, Jared is going to share with us some of the research he's done where he's found some of these instances and that sort of thing. But it's harder to come by, certainly. The historian Mark Burden surveyed Baptistic church books in the 17th century, and he did not find what at least he regarded as a clear self-referential use of the term Baptist until 1691. So again, it's always hard to prove a negative and say this was never used. However, certainly in the early decades, it wasn't used consistently, if at all. So that's the sort of story on the ground. And yet, when we look at denominational histories, so these are people who, at the end of the 17th century, you really get the introduction of kind of denominations in the way that we think of them today. And in the 18th century, you get denominational historians who want to tell the story of their particular denomination. And amongst Baptists in the 18th century and on into the 19th century in Britain, these folks really start using this label Baptists to describe anybody and everybody who rejected paedobaptism in the 17th century. And one of the most sort of prominent individuals, and perhaps the first to do this in a serious way, was the gentleman who wrote the book pictured there, a man called Thomas Crosby. He's often labeled as, quote, the first Baptist historian. And it's from the fame of this book. This book has a sort of interesting story. Crosby, he did not initially set out to inaugurate Baptist history. In some ways, it was sort of thrust upon him. The gentleman, Benjamin Stinton, who Dr. Renahan referred to and talked a little bit about in his talk, Benjamin Stinton dies in 1719, and upon his death, he bequeaths to Crosby a number of important historical documents relating to the origins of the English Baptists. He called this collection a repository of diverse historical matters relating to the English Antipaedo-Baptists. It's a very important primary source for understanding some of the beginnings. There's still, anybody who wants to look into early English Baptists, you have to go and look at these documents. They're very important to this day. So we're all grateful to Benjamin Stinton for his labors. But in any event, he gives these to Crosby. Crosby sees, hey, this is kind of a big deal. These are important documents. He then gets in touch with a guy called Daniel Neal, who was another historian operating at that time, who you'll know because he wrote a book called History of the Puritans in 1732, which you can still find kind of in reprint edition today. And Crosby says to Neal, hey, you're writing this History of the Puritans. That's pretty cool. Look, I've got some good stuff for you. It will help you to include the story of the Baptists in your Puritan history. So he gives it to Neal. Go for it, Neal. Do your thing. And Crosby was very happy until Neal's book was published, and Crosby got a chance to read it for himself. And he was very disappointed because in Crosby's mind, Neal did not give the Baptists a prominent enough place in the story. Crosby said he was surprised to see the ill use Mr. Neal made of these materials, meaning the Stinton documents. He complained that Neal had condensed the entire story of the Baptists into a mere 5 pages and, quote, that too, with very great partiality. So, what is Crosby to do? Well, he decides he's going to do what Neal should have done, and he writes the history of the English Baptists, 4 volumes, the first kind of Baptist, big Baptist denominational history. Crosby is a Baptist. He's telling the tale of who he regards as his own sort of theological forebears. All right, well, what do we make of Crosby's history? In many respects, it's great. It's recording all sorts of important names and dates and events, and there's a lot in there, 4 volumes, it's a mighty labor, so good. However, there is also an unhelpful aspect to Crosby's work. Namely, it reflects his own biases as a 18th century Baptist churchman. He had some issues that he was trying to see sorted out in his own day, and he had a tendency to kind of foist his concerns back onto his telling of the tale of these 17th century folks. This is always a danger for historians writing history. You take your own issues, your own hang-ups, and you project them back into the past. We see this, we see this all the time. We're asking questions of historical actors that they were not asking, and it's okay to do that, but you have to know you're doing that, and you have to be intentional about doing that, because if you just sort of run with it roughshod without being careful, you tend to then distort what you're reading and ask them questions, get them to speak to issues that they weren't actually concerned about. So there's a little more translation work required to do that well. And unfortunately with Crosby, it doesn't seem that he did that well. What did he do? Well, he looked at all these Baptists. Remember, we said before, you did have some Baptistic types who rejected paedobaptism, and they were Arminian in their thinking, or at least Arminian-ish. Then you had folks who were also rejecting paedobaptism, and they were very Calvinistic in their thinking. Those are the 1644 folks. Well, Crosby said, you know what? I'm going to take all those people, and I'm just going to call them all Baptists with a capital B. Those are all the Baptists. But here's the problem. Those people in the 1640s did not have anything to do with each other. They did not work together, and they did not, and this is harder to prove, but I think they clearly did not regard each other as fellow travelers. So what Crosby's doing is he's taking a group of people who didn't actually have much to do with each other. They happened to come to similar conclusions on paedobaptism, and he's sort of uniting them conceptually with this label, Baptist, capital B. This is the issue. And he knew he was doing this, And he actually wrote about it, which makes it, I suppose, easier to prove that that's what he was doing. Here's what he says. He says that, English Baptists, ever since the beginning of the Reformation, he talks about ever since the beginning of the Reformation, they had been divided among Arminian and Calvinist lines. But even note the way you're saying there, they were divided along Calvinist and Arminian lines. Is that true? If a group is divided, that suggests they were together, and then they kind of divided. But did these people come together and say, hey, we're all Baptists, that's great, now, we have a disagreement over Calvinism, let's go our separate ways? That's not what happened. So it's really slippery. Anyway, he says, ever since the beginning of the Reformation, English Baptists divided among Arminian and Calvinist lines, and then Crosby writes that he would not, quote, he would not inquire into the reasons for their thus distinguishing themselves so as to hold distinct communities thereupon. So in other words, he says, yeah, these Baptists, they kind of separated along Calvinist Arminian lines, but I'm not going to worry about that. Why? Well, listen to what he says. He says, I am fully persuaded and clearly of opinion that this difference in opinion, meaning the Calvinist-Arminian difference, this difference in opinion is not a sufficient or reasonable ground of renouncing Christian communion with one another. And therefore, in this history, have not, in the course of this history, leaned either to one side or the other, but have taken facts as they came into my hands, without regarding to which of the parties they were peculiar. And I know that there are several churches, ministers, and many particular persons among the English Baptists who desire not to go under the name either of generals or particulars, nor indeed can justly be ranked under either of these heads, because they receive what they think to be truth without regarding what human scheme it agrees or disagrees with. Okay, so you see what he's doing. He's basically saying, I, as Mr. 18th century Baptist denominational churchman, do not think that Baptists should worry about these soteriological differences. We should all be united. And because I don't think that's something worth dividing over, I'm not really going to pay attention to what was going on in the 1640s. They were dividing over this, but I'm not going to worry about that. And I'm just going to call them all Baptists. So he's clearly trying to advance his own denominational ends at the expense of telling an accurate story about the past. And note, you could criticize that irrespective of whether you think he's wise or foolish in the way that he's thinking about soteriology. You know, I happen to disagree with him in terms of, are these issues worth sort of talking about and dividing over? But you do see that attitude today. You know, people will say, I meet pastors all the time who will say, if you ask them, is your church, Calvinistic? They'll say, well, we don't really like to argue over that kind of thing, and we think it's, better just to focus on what we agree on. Okay, I don't agree with that position, but it's a position and there's a logic to it. Fair enough. If that was all he was saying, fair dues. He's not. He's saying, because I think that in the 18th century, I'm going to impose that and project that. It's going to distort what I'm doing. And there's the problem. And here's the other problem. Because he does this, and he says that at the beginning, but then for the rest of the history, he just uses the Baptist big B label to describe everybody. Lots of people go on from this. They read his history, and because labels operate quietly, they just sort of take in a certain story about Baptist origins that is not actually, I think, an accurate or helpful story. Indeed, there was an annotated bibliography, published by the Baptist Historical Society in 1909 that has an interesting note after it lists Crosby's history. Has a little note that says, the leading fault with Crosby's history is that the old general Baptists and particular Baptists are intermixed deliberately, but with confusing results. Indeed. So, why is it confusing? Again, he's sort of retroactively connecting with this label two unconnected groups. Arminian-ish Baptists and Calvinistic Baptists did not have anything to do with each other, but you use this label and you connect them, you unite them, you project that, you call that into reality through the use of this label. So instead of recognizing two distinct unrelated groups who are doing their own things, different priorities, different relational networks, just different. He actually suggests that you had a big group of folks who were all sort of on the same page and they were together, but they had this disagreement over soteriology. And that's just not the way it is. And unfortunately, because labels interpret and tell stories, because they're so easily repeatable, because they operate quietly, they have a way of sticking around. And Crosby's framing of Baptist history actually had a profound influence on subsequent denominational historians who are reading this and taking this in. And subsequent scholars have almost universally treated Baptistic separatist types under this common label Baptist. And it's a conflation that yields confusing and sometimes, I think, unhelpful results. Because again, when you talk about Baptist big B and then you talk about general in particular, it suggests that you have this one thing that's common, Baptist, and it divides into two subgroups. Like last night's gelato. We had a thing called gelato, and you could get the cookie one and the strawberry one or whatever it was. It was very good. But it's both gelato. We're all having gelato. It's gelato. Gelato's the thing, and there's just two flavors. And when they talk in this way about Baptists with the big B in the early modern period, it suggests that there's a thing called Baptist, and you get two flavors, and they couldn't agree on soteriology, and that was, that's why they had to go their separate ways. But you can't separate if you're never together in the first place. And you see this in all sorts of histories. Let me just give you two examples, one kind of early 20th century and then one more recent. So here's a book called The Development of Religious Toleration in England, published by a historian called W.K. Jordan in 1938. And this book's interesting to me because he's talking about his theme, development of religious toleration in Britain, and he has chapters and sections on different religious groups. And he takes the decision in this book to have a single chapter on the Baptists during this period. He groups them together for the purpose of his analysis. And here's what he says. He says, though the division of the Baptist communion into two sharply separated doctrinal groups should engage the close attention of the historian of the sect, it does not appear that this schism extends importantly to Baptist thought in the larger areas of speculation, which must be examined by the historian of toleration. Now, kind of a mouthful, but think about what he's saying there. He's suggesting that you have a Baptist communion and it's divided into two sharply separated doctrinal groups. Okay, there were Baptistic separatists who were Calvinistic. There were Baptistic separatists who were Arminian-leaning. However, when you talk about it that way, it suggests they were, again, all together. They had a disagreement over soteriology and said, we can't work together, guys. Let's go our separate ways. And that never happened. Note, he talks about a schism. He says, this schism it does not extend, he says, in other ways. Well, you can't have a schism if you're never together. You can't have tension and division if you're not together. When sports writers talk about, there's tension in the locker room, there's division in the locker room, the assumption is the locker room should all be on the same page because they're on the same team, and so this division is a bad thing. When people like this historian use language of tension and schism and division to talk about early English Baptists, and that's why they're kind of in these general and particular camps, it presents a false narrative. But again, it does so quietly, so smoothly. You would never notice it if you weren't really thinking about it. Notice he also, one more thing here that's characteristic. He talks about their quibbles over salvation, Arminianism, Calvinism. He says, these things do not extend to Baptist thought in the larger areas of speculation with which he's concerned. Baptist thought. So again, there's a category called Baptist, and it's capable of generating a body of distinctively Baptist thought. Again, that's telling a story through the use of that label. And yet if these two groups had nothing to do with each other, how do they come to sort of shared conclusions, a shared sense of Baptist thought? It's not easily done. So again, this is the problem with this Baptist label, I think. One recent example, just to round it out, this is a newer book, late 20th century, a guy called T.L. Underwood writes what in many respects is a very fine and excellent book. Don't get the wrong idea. There's lots of wonderful things in these books. However, it illustrates this phenomenon. Underwood's book is about 17th century Baptists and Quakers and how they got along, or in most cases did not get along. And Underwood states that although particular and general Baptists, quote, agreed on the nature and method of baptism, they nonetheless remained separate. So again, it suggests what? It suggests a sort of pan-Baptist movement with a capital B, a movement that could agree on some things, baptism, while remaining separate because of unresolved disagreement in other areas. And this persists throughout Underwood's book, and it's you see this in the literature all over the place. So Underwood, for example, informs the reader that in 1644 there were probably only 50 or so Baptist churches in England, without any indication of what kind of Baptist churches these were. Later he describes John Bunyan as a key spokesperson for the Baptists, and refers without qualification to a generic Baptist concern. And in each of these instances, Underwood's language implies this common sense of identity. So many other examples we could look at, but the bottom line is that when some English Puritans begin in earnest to question infant baptism in the late 1630s, 1640s, the reality is that the mid-17th century category Baptist with a big B did not exist. And again, how could it? There weren't people around thinking these thoughts just 5 minutes prior. So what label do you attach to such people questioning infant baptism? Well, again, 1644 signatories didn't seem quite sure what to call themselves. Their opponents called them Anabaptists, but that told a misleading story about them. Later historians, denominational historians, called them Baptists with a capital B, dividing them further into general and particular Baptists, other labels that they were not using during this early period. Again, this is not as bad as the Anabaptist label in terms of telling a bad story, but it's still misleading when we really start to think about it. So what do we call them? Well, I think that the Calvinistic Baptistic separatists would have had much more in common with the Calvinistic Paedobaptists than with any Arminian-leaning Baptistic separatists. In the 17th century, Arminianism amongst Calvinists was seen as a very serious error. It was seen as a return in significant respects to the theology of Rome on key questions regarding the human will and sin and salvation. They did not take it lightly at all. And so the idea that the people who signed the 1644 would have somehow seen themselves as fellow travelers with Arminian folks, just because those people also didn't see paedobaptism in the New Testament, to me that's just a wildly anachronistic idea. They would not have thought that way, they could not have thought that way, and we don't have any good evidence that they did think that way. So what do we call them? Again, as I'll talk about in subsequent sessions, I think a more helpful way to see them is to see them as an outgrowth, a progression from the congregational movement. Congregationalists, as we've been talking about together, were Paedobaptist, and yet from within those congregations you start to get people questioning paedobaptism. So that's where I've used the term Baptistic Congregationalists, because rather than uniting these folks with people with whom they had nothing to do, Arminian-inclined Baptistic separatists, it actually shows a line of continuity with people who were both their friends relationally and had theological continuities which they shared in common, the Congregationalists. So we'll talk about that more next time. But to conclude now, just very briefly, why does this matter? Again, this is the kind of thing where I think it's easy to say, yeah, kind of who cares, right? You know, these labels. But the reality is that the use of labels really does add up over time. And yes, in any given instance, sometimes it can see as just a little thing, but in aggregate, the way we talk about those who came before matters. And I think in the first instance, we should want to understand our history as accurately as we can. If we have labels that are telling misleading stories, I think we should interrogate those and see if we can come up with something better. But in the second place, I think that a key piece of our work as pastors, as church leaders, as Christians in Reformed Baptist churches, it should be to recover and take delight in the rich theological heritage that is ours. I think church history is a real source of strength and encouragement, and the Reformed tradition is a mighty thing, a mighty work of God. I think it interprets Scripture accurately and well, and by seeing how labels have distorted our understanding of the past Baptist actors and seeing maybe more helpful ways to think about them, I think we can link back in with that broader stream of Protestant, Reformation, Reformed theology and biblical exegesis that I think is still a source of nourishment and encouragement on into the present. More on that in future sessions, but for now, thank you very much for your attention.